Bienvenidos, bienvenidas. I'll introduce myself while folks are getting settled into translation, which you'll find at the bottom. Those are the directions in Spanish. My name is Melissa Florer-Bixler. I'm the pastor of Raleigh Mennonite Church. We are here tonight through funding from a grant for vital worship with the Calvin Institute for Worship. And we're grateful for this year that Raleigh Mennonite Church was able to spend studying anti-racist worship practices. For us, what that meant was spending time interviewing and worshiping with churches in Washington, D.C. and Seattle. We participated in a joint choir over Lent with St. Ambrose Episcopal Church, an historically Black church in our community. We studied together, we attended to our own practices as a church. And one place throughout the year where we heard questions, tensions, and also just generative spaces for thriving were around race and sexuality. Some churches we met with were deeply engaging in anti-racist practices as they intersected with the thriving of LGBTQ people. Other churches were not engaging in practices beyond anti-racism. As a result, we decided that it could be productive for us at Raleigh Mennonite Church and for wider Mennonite Church to invite people in our community who serve our churches, some as people of color, some as queer people of color. And at this point, I'd like to introduce to you who those people are and who will be with us tonight. First, our moderator is AnnaBeth Roeschley, the Executive Director of Brethren Mennonite Council for LGBTQ Interests. We also have Shana Green, who is an activist and a pastor. Jerrell Williams, the pastor of Salem Mennonite Church and a writer. Joanne Gallardo, the conference minister of Indiana-Michigan Conference. Gratitude to each of you. We're so looking forward to hearing from you and being a part of this conversation.
Thanks, Melissa. It's good to be with you all. Thanks for being here. I want to thank Raleigh Mennonite Church and Melissa for initiating this necessary conversation and for inviting BMC to co-host. BMC is the Brethren Mennonite Council for LGBT Interests. I was just saying, I think tonight's event is a good example of how SCN churches can mobilize around justice making that is deeply intersectional and contextual and faithful. So good to be here. I would like to begin tonight by first offering a few remarks to hopefully contextualize tonight's conversation and situate it in our broader Mennonite landscape before turning it over to our panelists. First, a note on language, 2 notes on language. Given the interpretation, we will try to speak at a pace that makes that as easeful as possible. And secondly, we'll be using terms like, I'll be using terms like BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color, and terms like LGBTQIA, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, asexual. And I want to name up front that these signifiers, like so much of our language, can be limiting. These terms and identities, these terms and the identities that they represent are not fixed or homogeneous, but rather they reflect the differences and multiplicities within our communities and within our movements. So I encourage each of you as panelists to use the terms that are right for you. And I invite everyone who is listening to remember that while our words do matter and they have an impact, that liberation is not achieved solely or completely by finding the exact right word. So I want to invite us all into that spirit of grace. So for the last decade and more, we have experienced in many facets of our denominational life together, we've experienced queerness and race being pitted against one another. And while there are particularities to how this plays out in our Mennonite context, we know that these realities exist in broader faith-based circles as well, and even beyond faith spheres. I think for many of us, we run into these tensions, perhaps especially when trying to build coalitions and do organizing work, around social justice issues across faith traditions and across political alliances. So I want to get real and say it like it is. Racial justice work and BIPOC spaces are not always devoted to queer and trans liberation, and LGBTQ justice spaces and circles are not always devoted to BIPOC liberation. LGBT justice movements have a long entanglement with white and patriarchal domination, and this too often echoes kind of a Euro-descended Mennonite exceptionalism. These fractures between BIPOC and queer communities take root interpersonally through things like internalized norms and biases, lack of understanding, sometimes a reliance on what feels familiar. And these divisions are perpetuated systemically in the institutional norms that we exist within, even as we're struggling against them. And these institutional norms, I think, also echo theological norms and dominant modes of biblical interpretation. So as we've named, Mennonite Church USA and the people within it have this history of pitting marginalized people against one another. And sometimes this has happened deliberately and strategically in the name of so-called unity in the church. And while this negatively impacts all of us, I think it is crucial to name that these divisions have been most harmful to people at these intersections, namely LGBTQ and same gender loving people of color, whose fullness can get erased in this false binary. So we want to name this out loud. We're here to name this out loud. We can lament these fractures, and we're here tonight to hopefully expand our capacity to hold the complexities of all of this. And we're here to claim the liberatory potential of intersecting struggle, and frankly, to just have more nuanced and honest conversations, or at least to do that in a public sphere in this setting, because these conversations have been happening for a long time on the margins by various people in a lot of different ways. So again, it is really an honor to get to be here and be in conversation with these three leaders who embody dynamic realities at these intersections of faith and race and gender and sexuality. You are each leaders and people who bring deep wells of wisdom from your justice work in and outside of the church. And as a panel tonight, I hope we can model non-polarizing ways to engage the tensions, questions, and the possibilities before us. And we hope to help our faith communities build practices oriented around collective liberation. So that is what we're hoping to do tonight. Thanks to our audience for being here. And Joanne, Shana, and Jerrell, thank you for each being here and for all that you're doing and being in the world. I would love to begin by having some tech difficulties over here. I would love to begin by asking each of you what brings you here to this conversation. And you can feel free to say anything you want about your background or history or the lineages that have shaped you, whatever you would like to share in terms of how you're entering this conversation. Joanne, let's start with you, followed by Shana and then Jerrell.
Sure, thanks a lot. It's good to be here. My name is Joanne Gallardo. I am conference minister for Indiana, Michigan Mennonite Conference. I've held that role for the last 2 years now. It will be 2 years in June. I've been a part of MCUSA for the past 22 years. I did not grow up Mennonite. Through my parents, I was connected to both the Catholic Church and Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, IFB. It's a Baptist fringe group. I've been a pastor for 10 years. I graduated from AMBS and Goshen College. I identify as queer. I am Latina. I'd say that one of the questions, AnnaBeth, you asked about being shaped, and I'd say I've definitely been shaped by women in my journey through higher education and in pastoring, including queer women and queer women of color. And it's my goal as I continue my education to continue to learn from queer people of color, as I admit that that's a bit of a dearth in my growing up experience, in my academic experience. So queer people of color to me are still an anomaly. Knowing myself and Shana and a couple of other people. So I come to this conversation feeling very intense about having this conversation, at the same time lacking that community, if that makes sense.
Hello, thank you, Joanne. And I'm glad to be your friend, by the way. I am Shana Green. I am a distant daughter of Hagar. I am the great granddaughter of Thelma. I am the granddaughter of Edna. And I am the beloved only daughter of Arlene, who has left us to be in heaven. I recognize that my lineage is that of stolen people brought to stolen land. And that is where I start my journey. I am newly Mennonite, always Anabaptist. And I am what you might call a rogue pastor. I pastored in another denomination that was not affirming. And because I'm grown, I left. And I made the decision that I would not become a part of another denomination until in behavior and on paper, they were reconciled, repentant, and affirming. And I'll tell you what, y'all Mennonites did the thing. Just in time for me to be married to my wife by a Mennonite pastor. And so thankful for that. I grew up Catholic in Washington, D.C., around a whole bunch of Black people. So my life has been steeped in chocolate city and politics. I am a firm believer in activism. You see something, you say something. And when you say something, say it like you mean it. I did not graduate from seminary. I make do off the scholarship of my lived experience, which is very different than some folks who have done it other ways. But I do believe that in certain spaces that also keeps me oppressed and keeps me marginalized. So I'm thankful to be a part of this conversation with all of you, because my Blackness matters, my lesbianness, my queerness, my gender nonconformness. And I represent a lot of intersections that are often not invited into the room. And so I am very grateful to Melissa, to AB for doing this and for inviting me. And I'm excited for the chat today.
Yes, thank you, Joanne and Shana. Hello, everyone. My name is Jerrell Williams. I'm the pastor of Salem Mennonite Church. I grew up in the Southern Baptist tradition in Texas, and that is as horrific as it sounds. Yes, I grew up in Texas. Went to college at Bethel College, where I was first introduced to Mennonites, I didn't officially become Mennonite until I was in seminary, but that was my first introduction at Bethel. It was also my first real introduction to LGBTQ inclusion as well, as I had several classmates that were a part of the LGBTQ community, and getting to know them, to love them, and to be with them really helped me to open up my heart, spirit, and mind to the need for conversations like this. Growing up, I was not affirming. I am now affirming pastor in an affirming church, an affirming tradition. And that is that are constantly wrestling with these conversations of how do we do this, right? How do we find these intersections and make sure that we are prioritizing liberation for all people. And so I'm very interested in that conversation. And so I'm just glad to be here with you all and excited for the conversation.
Thank you all. I was getting a little sound delay and I wanted to check my sound again. I think it might.
Sounds good.
Am I sounding okay?
Now you just froze
All right.
up. Just
Jerrell, you were cutting out there at the end, but it might have just been as the participants were coming. You said it, Shana, that we're inviting, or that you bring a lot of, you said how you bring a lot of intersections into the room. And I think that's what we want to invite and honor in tonight's conversation. I've shared a little bit and kind of offered a really broad sketch of, where kind of my take on how to name where we're at right now. I am curious how each of you would speak to that. Where are we at collectively right now? How would each of you articulate what feels most pressing around racial justice and queer justice in the Mennonite Church right now? Let's start with Jerrell on this one, followed by Joanne and then Shana.
Yeah, great question. I would say one of the things that I've really noticed on my journey through a church, I've been a pastor for 4 years, within MC USA, and I feel one of the pressing things that we need to have conversations about is learning the skill of talking about more than one thing at a time, because I feel like part of this conversation becomes a conflict around airtime. Like, all right, so which one are we talking about today? We're talking about LGBTQ inclusion. We're talking about racial justice. Like, which one are we tackling today? And which that kind of language and that kind of way of talking about things really isolates one group and pushes other conversations, like kicking the can down the road type of thing. And so I think it's really pressing for us to really understand that we can have these conversations at the same time, and we need to have these conversations at the same time and strategize as churches, as people of faith, as AnnaBeth, strategize around how we can provide support and liberation for all people, and particularly looking at these two lenses. And so I think, like, developing the skill of, like, yes, we have the capacity to talk about both of these things, and we have to talk about both of these in order to move forward. Because if we're not able to talk about both of them, then we're just competing, put them in opposition to each other, or they're competing for time, money, resources, whatever we're talking about, and that just puts two oppressed groups against one another.
Yes, I want to affirm everything Jerrell said. I feel that definitely. I'm a writer and I'm a planner, so I wrote 4 things down. What feels most pressing right now in terms of queer justice and racial justice. The first thing that I've seen at convention after convention, at Hope for the Future, it's a BIPOC gathering of Mennonite folks. After Hope for the Future, after going to each one, is this tendency to erase queer people of color, particularly in the Anabaptist tradition. I feel that at these gatherings, there's just this thought that there are not queer people of color that exist. And just sort of that denial is erasure. And I think that's a really pressing issue. I think there is, I know there is white supremacy at play when you make people of color a monolith on the topic of queer liberation. Glenn Guyton, executive director of MCUSA, wrote a wonderful article not too long after we had a special delegate assembly about not to tokenize people of color when it comes to questions of queer liberation. And I can put that in the chat. Third, I said helping people understand that racism and homophobia are fruit from the same tree. It's really hard to talk about one without talking about the other. They go hand in hand. And fourth, I said allowing the space for people to come out or not come out as they so discern. As we have been talking about queer liberation in the church, I have unfortunately witnessed some outing, excuse me, intentionally and unintentionally. And I believe that that as we enter this conversation, which is new to some of us, being aware of these dynamics, these intersectional dynamics, the fact that some people may not want to be outed. There are queer people of color out there who may not want to be outed for fear of retribution from anyone. That we need to take special care of our queer folk, of our BIPOC folk, especially of those who have intersecting identities right now. And remember that this is, I mean, like I said, fruit from the same tree. I don't think you can separate queer liberation from my liberation as a person of color.
Ooh, okay, Jerrell, okay, Joanne. Wow, so I encourage everybody to get a pen because I will decolonize your bookshelves today. I have a lot of book quotes. I'm a voracious reader. I read about a book every 2 days a day. I feel like we are in the parable of the sower by Octavia Butler, not the parable by Jesus, followed by Bible-loving people. And there's a quote in Parable of the Sower that says, live. That's all anybody can do right now. Live, hold out, survive. I don't know whether good times are coming back again, but I know that it won't matter if we don't survive these times. And again, that is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler, the mother of Afrofuturism and Afro sci-fi. But I feel like all I have known are perilous times. I was born in the 70s, 79, but the 70s nevertheless. And growing up, if it wasn't my Blackness, it was my bigness. If it wasn't my bigness, it was my femaleness. And so as I live and sit, I think what is pressing for me, it is hard for me to say what is pressing for me right now because I'm always pressed. Pressed but not crushed, persecuted, not defeated, okay? Shut down but not destroyed. I gotta finish it up. It's taking all I have not to finish the whole thing, but I'm gonna try to keep moving because I got 4 minutes. But I think, like Joanne said, you cannot separate liberation can't be divided into a pie. In order to have radical liberation, and I don't mean radical in the way that the media makes us think of radical. Radical simply means the root. And to get to the root of liberation, we got to want everybody free. My Blackness, my cisgenderedness, transness, non-binariness, whatever the spectrum is, we have to have this desire to want everyone free. So all this talk about the co-opting of Blackness in the queer spaces, or the co-opting of queerness in Black spaces, and some of that, we have to realize that the mechanism in the machine of white supremacy works without implicit or complicit agreement. It doesn't need you to agree or to say, yes, I believe in white supremacy. The machine will continue to recreate itself and eat whatever is in front of it. So when I think about what's pressing, I think about the fact that my Blackness is to whiteness what my queerness and lesbianness is to Blackness. Because oftentimes in Black communities, homophobia runs rampant, because the oppressed is taught to oppress others, which is part of this capitalistic colonized machine that we're a part of. And so I can't identify one thing or a group of things that are pressing right now, because as a fat, Black, deeply voiced, non-conforming, lock-having, nose-pierced, married to a woman, lesbian, queer person, it all be pressing. I be pressed. And so it's hard for me to just pick one thing.
I just want to say that I'm honored to be on an Anabaptist Zoom call where Octavia Butler was quoted. That made possibly my entire month.
Thank you, Joanne.
And hopefully it's not the last. Yeah, wow. There's just so much already that you all have offered in terms of the context, the layers, the foundations. I hope we can dig in. There's a lot more I would love to dig in around and circle back to. Yeah, but I think you've each really helped to offer really necessary framing as we dive in here. Yeah, I would love to hear what, in your experience, have been some of the helpful skills, practices, resources, strategies. Jerrell, I believe you were mentioning the need to strategize as a church. What's been helpful for you and in communities you've worked with that help people be careful and thoughtful and impactful around these intersections of racism and white supremacy and transphobia and homophobia? And of course, we know that there's additional intersections of colonialism and ableism and ageism, right? Capitalism, all of these things. And we're kind of holding the particularities around race and gender and sexuality tonight, but recognize the broader scope. So what have been the helpful strategies and practices, and how do we take those into spaces and conversations and institutions where we see this active pitting against each other, where, you know, spaces where we're really aware of the intentional division and fracturing between racial and queer justice. Let's start with Shana, Jerrell, and Joanne for this one.
You did not hear my prayer to not call on me first. I do not appreciate it.
This is flexible. You could pass it. That's fine.
ABC it, so she in charge.
No, this is a participatory conversation. So if you need a minute, pass it and we'll come back. I'm good with that.
I don't mind. I just wanted to be clear that I had been praying about it. But that's what happens. People have been praying for the Lakers and everybody else, and look at what's going on. So anyway, next author for your list today is Audre Lorde, my favorite Black queer, a mother. But I think the greatest strategy I have for myself, because I think as people who especially do work at the intersection of race, queerness, at the intersection of race and anything really, because racial justice is so heavy. I think self-care has to be the most important strategy that you have, how you tend to your own garden, because this world will eat you up, okay? And so Audre Lorde has a quote that says, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies of me and eaten alive. And I think that is one piece of it, because I think Joanne talked about like the tokenizing and some of that. I've been in a church and asked, how come I passed all the Black churches just to come to this particular Mennonite church? Or I become part of a location or part of a place, and now I'm the diversity hire that don't get paid. And I am expected to do all of the emotional and intellectual labor for my people, apparently, what is deemed my people. But I think part of those practices have to include, and it means that white people got to do the work. I can teach you to fish, and I'm willing to do that. And every Black person isn't. You cannot expect every BIPOC person, and I usually say Black because I'm Black, but I understand BIPOC as a term. But you can't expect every BIPOC person to educate you. Some people don't have the bandwidth for it. They don't have the capacity. But I thank God that I do. And so I think one of my strategies is education. I teach anti-racism, I teach gender diversity, not just to the church body, but to people. And I think it's really important to educate. Now, do I think education is the only way? No, because we got whole ivory towers built to education, and people are still racist and homophobic and foolish. So I don't think it's another way. I don't think one more book need to be written on how not to be mean to Black people, or how not to deny trans people access to care. But still keeping it in the forefront. I think another thing is not striving to not be racist, but striving to be anti-racist. Not just striving to be, well, I'm not homophobic. No, strive to be affirming and giving a feeling of belonging. Because the question in the Bible is, when is a thief not a thief? And Jesus asked the disciples, and they were like, oh, when he stopped stealing. That's not the truth. It's not when he stops stealing, it's when he gives of his own hand. And so at the end of the day, we have to put in the spiritual work, the physical work, the emotional work of racial justice and queer justice, because lives really do depend on it. Families really do depend on it. Housing, food, all of the privileges that people take for granted really depend on us individually co-laboring in the work, whether you identify at any of the intersections or not. It can't just be because you got a Black best friend, which that's a conversation for another day. It can't just be because, well, my friend Betty has a queer daughter. No, it has to be because you have an internal and an inherent and an innate desire for people to live wholly, to live fully. And when I say wholly, I'm talking WH, to live fully and to have that radical peace that we all deserve to have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shana. Yeah, I think one strategy that I've really thought or have practiced here in my congregation, but also as a local activist within the Salem, we also have a attachment city, Salem Kaiser area here in Oregon, has been knowing, like, as a church community or as a organization, knowing that you can be a safe place for people, right? Not everything is always marching in the streets, rallies, and things like that. But a lot of times, sometimes it's, vigils when someone's been killed or experienced harm. Sometimes it's just, there's a white nationalist rally happening in downtown today. Everyone come to the church, let's have some food, right? Everyone come to our building and let's have some food and let's think about what to do next. Let's support each other in these ways. And so support for BIPOC folks, support for LGBTQ folks is as important as fighting against the white supremacist system, because that is fighting against it, right? Like making sure that the people in your community are taken care of is important work, right? Making sure activists are fed who are doing the work, right? Making sure they have places to go, because a lot of the stuff, you ain't making millions, right? And so, you know, recently I was, I worked with or I volunteer with a interfaith group here in town. And one of the local activists, you know, didn't have money for gas. Like, didn't have money for gas. They couldn't go out, get food, and do the things they needed to do. And so we raised funds to be able to make sure that they were taken care of during that time. And that work is super important stuff. And so who's in your community? What BIPOC folks, LGBTQ folks, like who are the vulnerable people in your community, and how are you also taking care of them? Who are the activists in your community who need to be sustained, right? Need to be fed, who need, you know, money, cash flow, whatever it may be, and how can you support them is a very important piece of all of this. And so being a sanctuary for people, being a place where people can come and have that kind of support, I actually believe that churches in particular are well equipped for that, because we kind of know that practice, right? Like we know how to create, at least I like to think that we know how to create safe spaces for people to be. And so I advocate for that all the time with not only my own congregation, but with any of the organizations that I work with, is, you know, make sure that you're making room for people to be fed. Make sure you're making room for people to be sustained in this work, because it is, as Shana said earlier, it's about survival, right? We gotta make sure these people are living out here. And so I'm a firm believer in making sure that, you know, you're connected with the BIPOC community, make sure you're connected with the LGBTQ community, and making sure that they are sustained and fed, especially, you know, all you white congregations out there. You know, make sure that you contributing. Not only are you getting fed, but make sure you're feeding others as well, because that's very important.
And my additions to that, I should also be clear that I operate in mostly white spaces. So sometimes concepts of intersectionality and so forth need to be like broken down, or we need to go back to like some beginning building blocks, some basics. So as far as strategies, I always really encourage people to come to conversations in good faith. It's sort of a wise as serpents and innocent as doves thing. To be aware of those who come to intentionally misunderstand you, and to protect yourself from that, at the same time, assuming the goodwill of the other person and asking questions. I've been asked some very interesting questions in my life, and some of them had malicious intent. Some of them were genuinely seeking understanding. So it has been a practice for me to come to a conversation in good faith. I would also hope that anyone I dialogue with, or anyone that where dialogues happen in MCOSA, that people come to it in good faith. Like I said, going back to the basics, educating people on intersectionality, and of course, attributing it to Kimberly Crenshaw. I was at a recent gathering where, I mean, I hear this stuff all the time, right? I'm talking with other folks, but the concept of intersectionality being like, wait, what? Like, what is that? Wait, I guess a person can be discriminated if they are a woman and a person of color. Oh, and a queer person. Like we can't assume that all this clicks in place for people. My guess is you came on this call tonight because you know some of this already, but to not make assumptions about what people know. So a strategy I believe in is taking it back to the basics and making sure we're on the same page. And sort of like what was alluded to before, not every person of color has the bandwidth to educate you on that. Not every queer person has the bandwidth to educate you on that. So committing to being a lifelong learner as a practice, I think, is super important. I know it's easy for even me, myself, to say, oh, I've heard that already. I read that thing. I know. No, but to open yourself to be a lifelong learner. Surrounding myself, I try to surround myself with people who stretch me. I try to find people for whom I'm going to stretch, but that's just who I am as a person. And insofar as it's a brave space, right? And you can enter without fearing violence. I can't emphasize enough, if you're a person from a minoritized community, to take care of yourself, to be aware, that wise as serpent sort of thing, and take care of yourself. And if you enter something that feels uncomfortable to you, to say what needs to be said. And if you see something that is being said, to speak up. I think a lot of time the burden is put on queer people, people of color, to say things, to point out that that was homophobic, to point out that that was racist. Anyone can do that. That's not something you have to like, oh, I'm going to let the other people do that. You can call it out at any time when you see it. And in fact, I think, I don't want to speak for everyone in this little panel here, but like, we want you to call it out. We want you to say things that are not okay. We want you to have the ears and eyes to know that things that happen are not okay, and our voices are tired, right? So your voice is always welcome.
Yeah, I really want to echo that point. I think especially because there are, it seems, a lot of allies on this call from predominantly white congregations. But yeah, in whatever capacity, you know, we find ourselves as an ally, there's really so much of this work to be done. And I hear each of you in various ways speaking to the need for the burden and labor of trying to you know, dismantle these interlocking forms of oppression, for that work and labor to be shouldered by allies and committed accomplices. I think that's really huge. I kind of want to turn the same question through a different angle. We've already been naming how supremacy cultures thrive on multiple forms of oppression, right? And how these forms of oppression operate on both personal, interpersonal levels and systemically, institutionally, et cetera. But we also need to name that these same systems of oppression show up within our own communities and within our own social justice movements, right? I can say that some of the best movements that I've been a part of in queer Mennonite space, and you know, spaces where we're working to empower marginalized communities, some of these best efforts for transformation are heavy with these same realities, right? So I'm curious to hear from you. In your experience, how does this limit the ability for people from marginalized or oppressed identities, communities? How does that limit the ability to build power and connection? And what have you learned, not only in fighting the powers that be, but in trying to tend to this work closer to home and among beloved kin and beloved community? I meant to give the order in advance. I'll try to remember to do that next time. But let's start, Joanne, with you on this one, and then Shana, and then Jerrell.
When you ask this question, excuse me, AnnaBeth, I just view supremacy culture as a cage, and it's a chain around our neck and around our feet. And supremacy culture isn't something we just rage and rally against. It's a tragic form of violence, and there are survivors of it, victims of it, and there are perpetrators. And so it's not enough for us to just abolish supremacy, even though we definitely want to do that. It's kind of empty and cheap unless we also talk about healing and reparations. I'm reminded of the book by Danya Edelman, which I really recommend, on repentance and repair. It's so hard to cultivate empathy for those in bondage from supremacy. I find that hard for myself when I see people stuck in that Mennonite exceptionalism, right? That white exceptionalism. It's really hard for me to sometimes have empathy, but it's also a sad equalizer, because as is said in a lot of anti-racist spaces, this has a lot to do with white people and their well-being, as well as people of color and our well-being, as well as queer people of color and our well-being. White people, straight people, people of color, LGBTQIA plus people, those touched by colonialism, ableism, capitalism, sexism. We bind ourselves and we bind each other. And so when we disentangle that and to liberate ourselves from that, it's just an ongoing process. And I don't know of a queer person, a BIPOC person, a BIPOC queer person who has said, and now we're done. It's going to be a lifetime to understand and know how to disentangle ourselves from supremacy culture and those things that truly bind us down and keep us oppressed. In terms of working closer to home, I've found difficulty in certain relationships regarding fighting the powers. AnnaBeth was your question. I have had times, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, I'm sorry. Where I feel like I am all talk, or I have no problem naming things loudly in the public square. And when someone gets close to me and states something like an all lives matter kind of thing, it really gets to me. And I have friends who say, are you sure it's a racial cultural thing? I think it's a human thing. And that sort of diminishes my experience, right? And to which I hope to respond no, and to push back on that. And I struggle with the powers, as you say, in relationships where people have a limited view of queerness, where bi-erasure happens, assuming that straight presenting is straight, denial that folks have queer relatives. I get tired. It's hard. I try to talk back against it. There are times when I give up with educating. I just get tired. And sometimes in my closest relationships, I wonder if it would be better coming from someone else other than me, which is where I feel it's important for white people and straight allies to speak up for BIPOC folks, queer folks, because it's a long haul for us.
Ooh, boy, oh boy. So I struggle with this question. Let me start by saying that. And I struggled to the point of almost emailing and saying I wasn't going to answer it, but I did want to be the problem child of the panel. So I struggle with this question because I'm going to answer it. Don't worry, I'm just setting it up. I struggle with this question. Oh, let me give you the quote first. This time it is James Baldwin, who is right here. I am part Baldwin, part Badu, and a little bit of Bayard Rustin because I just like his story. But the quote for now is by James Baldwin, and it deals with disagreement. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and my right to exist. And I think often what happens when BIPOC, especially like I cannot pass for any other race, okay? Like, I am a chocolate girl. I have queer passing privilege because I am a femme presenting woman in that regard. So people make their little queer jokes and they're not ready for my verbal rat-a-tat-tat that comes after that, because I don't play about me, and I don't play about the people in the communities of care that God has trusted me with. But I struggle with answering this question because what I don't want to happen, I think about Breonna Taylor, I think about Eric Garner, I think about Samir Rice, and I think about how their state-sanctioned murders are wiped away by people saying, well, Black people kill Black people all the time. Well, Black on Black crime exists. And I feel like this question is right at the edge of that. And I'm not trying to give nobody a pass on saying, well, and I said it earlier today, if in the Black community there are homophobes, then I must be fine. Like, I mean, if it's good for them, it's good for me, the goose and the gander. And that's really problematic. And so I struggled with answering the question about those beloved relationships in kin, because what I have found that white supremacy does is it looks for any excuse to shirk accountability. And I don't want to spoon feed you and all of my Black girl magic and articulateness and all of that I get complimented on so regularly, which is also a microaggression, by the way, while we're having this conversation. But I don't want to spoon feed that since it happens in my community, it's okay. So instead, what I will say is, when Joanne was talking about the cage, I love that. And if you have not had an opportunity, like the Roots of Justice, anti-racism work really breaks down that cage of oppression and the iceberg of oppression, because you only see this much, but is this big? If I had time, I would walk you through the walk of oppression that began with the Papal Bull, but I don't have that kind of time, I only got 4 minutes. But at the end of the day, all the isms, the sexism, the classism, all of those things are about maintaining power. And this idea of powers that be, it honestly made me think of Public Enemy, Fight the Power, which was in those good 80s and 90s, we were still having this same conversation. So something that I have learned during the work closer to home is that Lenny Duncan said it in his book, and I can't think of the name of it. I know Bev is on here, so she can put it in the chat. Look, I got people working, sorry. But Lenny Duncan says that he didn't choose to be an activist. He didn't choose to go out here and educate. But if he didn't become a leader in it, he would be killed by it. And I think that is the reality of this work and fighting the powers that be. Don't you think I would rather be on a beach with a virgin colada, or maybe not a virgin colada, maybe a full-blown promiscuous colada? Like, don't you think that I would prefer to be able to watch TV, to be able to go outside, to be able to check my email, to be able to watch the news and not see people that look like me murdered or sexually assaulted, or trans women in suitcases and nobody's charged with their murder? Don't you think I would love that? Like, that would be great. But having to fight all the time was not a choice, it was a calling. And I think recognizing that and recognizing, and this goes back to what Jerrell said about, are you taking care of those people in your community or in your circle of care, is what I like to call it. Are you taking care of those people? Have they ate? Do you know? Do they have gas? Do you know? While you're tokenizing and tasking, make sure that you are offering them a tithe of your time, your talent, and your treasure so that they can go on and live this life the same way that we do. So I frame it in, I don't want to give nobody a pass, because I know that ain't what the point of this is, but recognizing that we did not sign up for this. We were called to it. It's almost like, it is exactly like ministry. Nobody, and any pastor will tell you, nobody woke up and was like, you know what, I'm going to be a pastor. that is what I'm going to do. Now, some of you, I don't know, Mennonites a little different with it sometimes. They born to be pastors, but I did not wake up. I woke up like Jonah and was like, let me grab these Nikes and just hit the road running. I'm going to Tarshish and I'm going to mind my business. But recognizing that doing the work close to home or far from home, whether you do the work in the gutters, on the curbs, in the margins, or whether you do it on national platforms, when you are a queer, or when you are a Black, Indigenous, or a visible person of color that fortunately or unfortunately you decide does not have the privilege of passing, it is a fight everywhere.
I just really want to affirm that. And it's so refreshing for me to hear that, like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to do this. This wasn't what I set out to do. I set out to be a pastor. I didn't set out to be an activist. I don't want to, what are you talking about? But it's a calling and it's a survival mechanism. It's really interesting. It's both.
Yeah, no, thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Shana. Y'all said everything I wanted to say. But one thing I will say, or add to this is, I think one thing that all of this creates, right, that white supremacy forces us to do is, it forces us to choose who has power and who doesn't, right? It dangles the carrot of power in front of us. It's like, okay, we can either give it to the Black folks or we can give it to the LGBTQ folks. Both of y'all can't have it, right? So one of y'all pick, right? So fight for whoever's going to get it. And it's been really difficult because working within, especially like I'm thinking of just here in like my location, in my context, working with different organizations that either aren't trying to, or like are having conversations about being affirming, or organizations that are just predominantly white and don't really take the needs of BIPOC folks into consideration necessarily all the time. And so it becomes really difficult to like, because there's strength in numbers, right? Ultimately, right, there's strength in numbers, right? Like if we're able to care about each other's causes and support each other, then we can amass the power that we need and the care that we need. But there's always, there's always a struggle. And then like one thing that I get really frustrated with is I'm always called in to talk to the Black folks. Like I remember just recently having a conversation with some local activists. All of them, or most of them were white, not all of them, but most of them were. And we're having a conversation about going to talk to a predominantly Black organization that was very cold on their affirmation of the LGBTQ folks. And their first idea was like, let's send Jerrell. And I'm like, yo, you want me to argue with my own people? Like you want me to go alone and fight with my own people? And so I think we have to always take this conversation, be careful about this conversation, because you're asking us to, in some way, isolate ourselves from our own communities at times, right? And I'm speaking as a Black man here. And I have a way of handling or working within my community to affirm LGBTQ folks, and that doesn't always look on the same timeline as everyone expects it to look. But I also got to think about like, yo, I'm out here in Salem, Oregon. There's a lot of white folks out here. There ain't many Black folks out here. And so I have to actually like think about like my own security, my own safety, who are the people I can talk to. And so I also want to say, like, be careful who you're like when you're asking people to do that kind of labor, right? Like, I mean, it does have to have a conversation, but people also have to be, there's a different way of handling that kind of situation, right? Like I wouldn't say to my LGBTQ sibling, like, hey, you need to go talk to your people, right? And tell them to stop being racist, right? That isolates them from the only community they got, right? And so being careful about those conversations and labor that you're asking people to do. But I also think there's a level of, I'm trying not to take so much time, but I also think there's a label of there's work to be done in just building relationships as well. Like that there is an isolation or a segregation between LGBTQ folks and Black community. Like there needs to be some more conversation there, especially when those intersections have are part of it as well. Like when we have a person of color who's also LGBTQ, like where is their safe space in that conversation? Like if the LGBTQ community is having racist practices, the Black community is having homophobic practices, like where is their safe space too? And so making sure that they're also taken care of, and that we are building community in those ways, I think is also helpful. So yeah, so I guess I don't know if I'm fully answering the question well, but I just always want us to be careful when we're asking people to do that kind of work, because it can be isolating work, and isolation can lead to death sometimes. And so I really want us to just be mindful. Like, yeah, I don't know. I hope I answered that well.
I want to take the language from Joanne. I want to affirm something you said. Were you at that beginning part when you were talking about either this person can have it, that person can have it, this person can have it? You know, those are some real old colonial tricks. And I know a lot of these type of meetings focus on what white people can do, what white people can do. And to me, we just prioritizing whiteness all over again. So I'm going to take a bit of an aside and talk to our Black, Brown, Indigenous, and BIPOC folks and say, be careful of desiring proximity, because it's a trick. And because what white supremacy wants you to think or believe is that if you just get a proximity to whiteness, a respectable proximity, then you're good, and whatever's going to befall you is not. But at the end of the day, that is the lie of white body supremacy, because it's not. Because as soon as you step away from the politics of respectability, you are just another Black person, you are just another brown person, and your life is seen as not as valuable. So I really just want to offer, because we spend a lot of time focused on white body supremacy, what white congregations can do, and I mean, from what I have seen of Mennonites, it is the majority. No matter what the pamphlets say and the stock photos, I have not seen a church that demographic like the stock photos yet. But I just want to offer that to the Black and Brown and Indigenous and people of color folks on here, because I see you too. I feel you too. I know sitting in this kind of space is different for us. I know sitting among these folks and looking at these faces and trying to not overanalyze, trying not to nitpick, trying to ignore the microaggressions, and doing all of that is hard labor. So I just want to offer that to us. Number one, take care of yourself and prioritize what you're feeling and give your body a break and be kind to yourself. And number two, beware of the lie of proximity. Desire equity over everything. It is equity or bust around here. So I'm sorry, I'm somebody can reclaim the time, but
I'm going to reclaim the time because you've got me thinking. Because conversely, white people, proximity to people of color does not make you a person of color. You're not an honorary person of color. I'm not in charge of the cookout, but you're probably not invited. It doesn't. And proximity to queerness also does not make you honorarily queer. I hear these things, I hear these terms, and I don't think people mean to say them. But Shana, what you were saying really resonated with me. And I'm like, yes, conversely, proximity to queer people, proximity to people of color does not make you somehow oppressed, does not make you more oppressed than white people, does not make you special in a certain way.
I'm happy to have this keep going. I think we should move into a portion where we can invite each of you to keep responding to what's been coming up for you in this conversation and questions you might have for each other. I do want to say that I received a message that yeah, we've been using the word queer, and we haven't been naming us as explicitly how trans and non-binary folks are also very much a part of our movements and our communities. And some of that, I think, like I said at the very beginning, is the way we use the term queer, some of us as an umbrella term, but yeah, I do want to just kind of invite us into some more expansive language around that, myself included. Yeah, I think something as part of kind of a response I would offer is any, any thoughts that you have specifically on how these intersections are affecting trans and gender expansive folks around and kind of the particularities around that. And kind of another layer would be what congregations can be doing in this time of overt crisis and anti-transness on the national scene and on the state level. Sorry, I feel like I'm throwing another question at you and inviting you all to respond, but that's part of what's coming up there as a response from trans folks among us. So I wanted to bring that into the conversation for sure. And I'm not going to call out an order because I think we can do this piece a little more organically.
I'm ready.
Yeah.
I unmuted my mic first. And I agree. I think, unfortunately, as we look at the statistics and we look at the pain and the dehumanization that our transgendered siblings are experiencing, even now at a national level, we didn't talk about it enough. I know a few of us mentioned it, but you are right. And there's no excuse for that. The fact that there's not someone someone that's transgender on this panel is problematic. But we also have to look at the demographic and wonder why there isn't someone representing the transgender community other than us, because to me, we don't all have the same experience, but I have to do the work of speaking for my trans siblings too when they're not in the room and when they're not at the table. It falls on all of us. I got to do the phone banks. I got to go to the marches. I don't do a whole lot of marching. I got plantar fasciitis, so I will be doing something else during that time. But we have to do the work too. And I think whomever messaged, and I think it's probably a larger feeling than just that individual who's able to message. They're absolutely right. They're absolutely right. And the intersection of my siblings that are transgendered, especially youth, and the fact that they represent such a large part of those who are experiencing homelessness, that are experiencing mental health crisis, that are experiencing the inability to do what the kids want to do at school, the inability to use the restroom in public places. Like, it ought break our hearts. But it ought not break our hearts just to weep and tell your neighbor. It ought break our hearts into action. When was the last time your heart broke and you did something? When was the last time you wept and then did something? The shortest scripture in the Bible is Jesus wept because he didn't stay there long. He went and did something. And I totally agree. And I think we do use the term queer as an umbrella, and we ought stop, just like we use BIPOC as an umbrella term, and we ought stop. But I understand why we do it, because it is an erased population of people. But I hear that and feel that, and I think we have to do our parts. Like, it's not us against them. It's not Black folks against queer folks. It's not queer. It's not LGB folks against transgendered folks. Like, we have got to do our part. to speak up, to put our money where our mouth is, to put our activism where our mouth is, and not leave anybody out here alone. Like, we talk about community, we talk about congregation, we talk about sanctuary. And maybe we need to go back and start talking about hush harbors, and when there was no other choice, how we had to worship and how everyone had a place and everyone had a seat. Because the way we're doing it and the way we're going about it from inside the community, I can say it's not working.
Yeah, thank you, Shana. And thank you, AnnaBeth, for reading that message out and putting this question to us. I mean, it's the pressing, right? It's the pressing issue currently. I mean, along with a lot of things, but like this is having real political, social implications for people, right? Like, lives are on the line, and we're seeing that play out as, you know, we hear of different legislation for gender affirming care and things like that, right? So like, this is a very pressing issue and conversation for us to be having and thinking about and acting on. And so I think I partially want to echo what Shana said, but also say that we need to pay more attention to how pressing, how things are happening politically, and how slow. Like, I know that churches, like, church stuff moves slow. Like, I understand that, right? Like, church work moves very slowly. But when you move too slow, you miss opportunities. And this is an opportunity for the church to be a helpful voice, to be a place for trans folks, and like, I don't know, I just think about just how pressing of a time it is, and these are the moments where, you know, like, that people remember, right? Like people will know who's on, you know, which side of the aisle you were on when we talk about this later. And so so for everyone, like, acting time is now, right? Getting yourself together to act is now, because we're seeing it play out in real time. And you know, yeah. And so I just think, like, yeah, being conscious of, like, the attack is happening now and it's in our face. Like, you can no longer say, oh, you haven't read the news that day, or you didn't hear about it, or you didn't know, you know, these people existed in some way, right? Like, no, it's in your face. Like, it's happening in your town, in your city, in your state. There's legislation to erase trans folks, to erase BIPOC folks. I mean, we're seeing some of the book bans happening as well, right? Like, so, like, yeah, action, the time for acting is now. And if you move too slowly, like the church has traditionally done, we may miss out on some opportunities to do while we're called the Lord's work.
Can I slide in and say one more thing, Joanne? Because I'm taking your time a little bit. I'm only going to take 96 seconds.
No, take my time, please.
I think Jerrell raised some, boy, the church and their discernment be taking forever. I just want to know, I'm in the middle of some personal processes on the way to some things. And I'm like, whoo, y'all gonna discern yourselves right into perpetuity. So I get it. But I think one thing that we have to do, and it kind of goes back to the beginning parts, is educate ourselves, because we have conflated so many things and it has become what has informed so much hatred because of this conflatedness. So if you can't answer the question of what is the difference between gender orientation and sexual orientation and gender expression, or you are still struggling with pronouns and what is cis and what is not cis and all of these things, if you have not heard the term, and I'm not going to say it because I'm not going to perpetuate it, but if you don't understand that there are people who are intent upon not honoring trans women as women, and you still read them books and watching them movies and playing them video games and visit them at Disney, you are complicit in the problem. It's not enough to be like, well, I'm on the middle of the fence. We cannot afford to be on the middle of the road anymore. We do not have the ability to just sit back and watch and wait and see what happens. We cannot continue to lift up the banner of Christ and all of these things when members of our community are going without or losing basic access to rights of life. And so I just think about that education piece. And surely, for as much as I, as a Black woman, don't intend to do the emotional labor for everybody, y'all better not be running around asking my trans siblings to do the work for everybody, because it is a lot and it is enough. And so even, and Jerrell, you use a man of God for sure, because you preach the message up in there, but even as it relates to the church, and even as it relates to people and what our part is to do, talking about it ain't enough. You can't just say, oh, well, our church is affirming. We have a statement, I can't even think of what this, a welcoming statement of love and rainbows, and we got the rainbow doors in the parking lot, and we got flags flying for pride and all of those things. If you are not involved in direct action, because kids are losing the ability to identify and express as who they are. Adults are losing the ability to be called by their names. Children are being dead named in schools. Like this isn't just a thing that we just talking about on what's today, Wednesday. This isn't just something we come here to talk about on Wednesday because we have nothing better to do. Real lives are at the end of these conversations. Black ones, trans ones, young ones, old ones. Real lives rest at the end of these statements and at the end of this. When you all go home, transgender people still are in Florida, in Kansas. I'm in Kansas right now. Still are being told they can't play sports, they can't use this bathroom, they can't do this, they can't do that. So you got to make it personal. And even if you got to be careful, what I've noticed in this conversation, as I look at this, when we got to this transgender piece, everybody got real careful. Everybody got like Jerrell set up real straight, and I haven't even let poor Joanne talk yet. I will. But everybody got real careful, even at the risk of messing it up and saying the wrong thing and having to be corrected and having to repent and reconcile. Say something, do something. Because we're not going to get it right all the time. You're not going to always know that you can't touch my hair. You're not going to always know that I'm a she, they. But you have to try. Joanne, reclaim your time, sis, because I'll be talking forever.
Well, I mean, you preached a sermon there. I'm not sure what else I could say to top that or contribute to that. I'm going to give it back to AnnaBeth.
No, I just echo, affirm. I appreciate the moment around this piece and kind of the ways, Shana and Jerrell, that you were like pushing back even a little bit on how I was framing a question. Like this, this is how we engage the gritty complexities at these intersections, and staying in places that are safe and comfortable, where we know we're not going to mess up, are definitely not going to be practices that help us respond to the people and lives that meet us in this time. So glad we can be doing some of that in the moment here. Is there any final word from each of you briefly? We're going to wrap it up here in a minute, but just want to give a chance to say anything else briefly that we need to hear as the Mennonite Church right now.
AnnaBeth, do you still want your question about the edge of liberatory struggle for us and where and to whom?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're gonna end in 5 minutes, so I can pose it and you can include that if you want, but I also think you can just say whatever you wanted. And I think we got into some of this. To me, I mean, I think we've been talking about this is an edge. The violence against trans people, and particularly Black trans women, right? Like this is an edge, and are we there, church, right? So feel free to comment on kind of where is an edge for you in this work, or just offer us the word that you think we need to hear to close this out. And you can each take about a minute. I want to close on time in part to respect our interpreter's time.
Of course. I think, as was insinuated in these conversations that we just had about trans rights and trans folk, I learned to stop making things binary. And when I learned that, I realized that the people who oppress people like me make things a binary. I find a lot of the rhetoric pitting different types of liberation against each other. And I think maybe what we are being called to now is some discernment. And by that, I mean when to listen and when to speak, and also when to shout. I think we're called to come as our true selves and in good faith. I think we are called to remember, as is oft quoted by people of color, that your liberation is bound up in mine. And when we enter our churches and our Mennonite gatherings and our conventions and whatnot with that mindset that we are all our collective liberation is bound up together, I think that starts to help tear down some walls that we've maybe put up around ourselves and around other people.
Shana, Jerrell, yeah.
Go ahead, Joanne.
Oh, okay. I was like, you going? Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you, Joanne, for that. I think so. What I want the Mennonite Church to be well, right? Like I want us to be well. I really like love our conference, our denomination, the people within it. And I want us to do well. All right. I want God to look at us and say, well done, my faithful servant. And I think that we only accomplish that by advocating for the liberation of all people. And put something in the game, right? You got to put something in the game. This ain't gonna mean nothing to you, right? I know some folks come from these country Mennonite towns where they're like, there's not a Black person in sight, there's not a out queer person in sight, right? There are I know someone comes from those backgrounds, those towns, those places, and you're gonna have to make this real for you. You really are. Like, you're going to have to put something in the game to where you can lose something, right? You got to risk something to be in this work, because there's folks that are risking it all, right? There are folks that are risking all that they have, and so you got to risk something in this work, and it has to be real to you. And you don't have to know everybody and have to comprehend every single concept that we talk about. I mean, educate yourself as well as you can, but you have to learn that you are not free if everyone else is not free, right? That you are, that white supremacy hurts you. Like, even as a white person, it hurts you. That this isn't just oh, I do this because I care for BIPOC folks, or I do this because I care about LGBTQ folks. No, I do this because I care about everybody, including myself. And I don't know. So put something in the game. You got to have some risk to it, and then you'll give it your all. Then it'll be at the forefront of your mind and attention. But you got to put something in the game.
I have to take 30 seconds, AnnaBeth, because I know we out of time. The last quote I'll give you today is in honor of Tina Turner, who went to be with the Lord today. And the first thing I started singing after I saw the news was, "We don't need another hero. We don't need another hero. We don't need another way home. All we want is life beyond the Thunderdome." And I encourage us all to think about when we're driving on the highway and we see a little Pinto or a raggedy car and it's cutting people off. What do we say? We say, "That's why your car looked like that." When you go to church, Jerrell, no, I'm telling the truth. When we go, that's why their car looked like that, all dinged up, because you drive like that. I encourage us all, when we go to our places of worship, our places of work, our places of community, this Sunday, Thursday, whenever you go, to ask yourself, why does my church look like this? And begin to take note of what you see. Because the church didn't make itself, we make it. So if it's not diverse, that's why ask yourself, why does the church look like that? If it's not welcoming to LGBTQ people, ask yourself, why does the church look like that? And take ownership of changing the culture, changing the atmosphere, and truly becoming the church that we want to see. And the last thing I'll say is, I'll echo Jerrell, I just want us to be well. I just want us to be well. AnnaBeth.
That's a beautiful note to end on. Shana, Jerrell, Joanne, thank you all so much for your presence and wisdom and vulnerability and courage. I'm gonna keep trying here despite tonight's tech woes. I'm offering my gratitude, and I want to invite our audience members to raise some hands and just extend energy and gratitude to our panelists. And I see it coming in the chat as well. I want to especially thank as well our tech support Stan and our interpreter Luz, and again to Melissa and Raleigh Mennonite for inviting this conversation. And on behalf of BMC and also Raleigh Mennonite, all of us, we really hope that tonight's conversation will be one that you continue in your church and community and conference, and that we as Anabaptists will lean into the messiness and complexity and liberatory possibilities of both our struggle and resilience as people. So thank you so much for being here.